The morning the Cimarron River swallowed Lenora Pritchard's farm whole, she stood at the edge of what used to be her front porch and felt something inside her go very, very quiet. It was the spring of 1882, deep in the Oklahoma Territory, and the rains had come with a fury that even the oldest settlers in Colton's Crossing could not recall seeing in their lifetimes. 3 days of unrelenting downpour had swollen the Cimarron past every bank it had ever known, and when the water finally came for the Pritchard homestead on a Tuesday morning just before dawn, it did not come gently. It came like a fist through thin paper, tearing through the low barn first, carrying off 2 mules, a season's worth of seed grain, and the better part of the south fence before Lenora even had time to pull on her boots. She had grabbed her daughter Maybelle, who was 7 years old and small enough to be carried, and she had run to the high ground behind the smokehouse. She had stood there in the gray, rain-soaked dark and watched the water claim everything her husband Roy had built in the 6 years before a rattlesnake took him from her. Roy Pritchard had been dead for 2 years by the time the flood came. He had been a good man, a steady man, the kind of man who kept careful records in a leather-bound ledger and checked the horses twice each evening before he came inside for supper. His death had left Lenora with 30 acres of decent soil, a debt at the Territorial Bank in Guthrie that she had been slowly, carefully paying down, a daughter who had Roy's dark eyes and stubborn chin, and a determination so bone-deep that the women at the church in Colton's Crossing sometimes whispered that Lenora Pritchard was more iron than woman. Lenora had heard that whisper and had never bothered to correct it, because iron kept standing when softer things fell down. But standing on that ridge in the April rain, watching the water roll brown and thick through her yard, Lenora felt the iron in her crack for the first time. The crops were gone. The barn was gone. The chicken coop, the root cellar's wooden door, the garden fence Roy had built from cottonwood posts the summer before Maybelle was born. Gone. What remained was the house itself, which sat on the highest point of the property and had survived with water damage only to its lower walls and floor, and the smokehouse, which had held because Roy had built it from stone. Everything else was ruin. She stood there until the rain stopped, which took another 2 hours. Then she picked Maybelle up even though the child was arguably too old to be carried, settled her on one hip, and walked down the slope to see what could be saved. The answer, it turned out, was not very much. Word traveled the way it always did in those territories, person to person and post to post, moving along the wagon roads and through the general store and across back fences wherever neighbors were near enough to have back fences. By Thursday, the women of Colton's Crossing had organized a collection of dry goods and preserved food for Lenora. By Friday, the men of the Presbyterian congregation had come out to help drain the lower rooms of the house and haul the ruined floorboards out to dry on higher ground. Lenora thanked each of them with a straight back and genuine gratitude, and she fed them biscuits made on the one pot she had saved from the kitchen, and she did not let herself cry in front of any of them. The banker in Guthrie sent a letter that arrived the following Monday. It was written in the careful, bloodless language that bankers use when they are explaining that sympathy and legal obligation are entirely different things. Lenora read it twice, set it on the table, and read it a third time. The sum she owed had not changed because the flood had come. The payment schedule had not changed. The bank was sorry for her difficulty and wished her every good fortune in her recovery. It was, in other words, not help. Lenora sat down at the table in her damaged kitchen, which smelled of river mud and wet wood, and she did the arithmetic on a piece of paper she had dried by the window. She had enough cash money to cover one more payment to the bank, and to purchase the bare minimum of seed and supplies to attempt a late planting. She would need a new barn, at minimum a small one, or she could not properly shelter the single horse that had survived, because she had kept him tied to a post on the ridge. She would need lumber, nails, labor. She would need the fence repaired before she could keep any livestock. She would need, and she sat with that word for a long time in the quiet of that kitchen, she would need more than she currently had the means to provide. It was the postmaster, a barrel-shaped man named Abe Whitfield, who mentioned Timothy Abbott. "You heard anything about that fella who bought the Granger spread up north of the Cimarron Bend?" he asked Lenora when she came in for her mail the following Wednesday. He was sorting envelopes with the practiced speed of a man who had been doing the same thing for 20 years, barely looking at his hands. "I heard he runs cattle," Lenora said. She had heard a little more than that, actually. She had heard that Timothy Abbott had come down from Kansas about 3 years ago and had built his operation from a small herd of longhorns into something considerably more substantial. She had heard he was a fair man with his workers, that he paid decent wages, and that he kept his fences properly. In the territorial cattle country of 1882, those were not small virtues. "His foreman fellow by the name of Chester Keel told me that Abbott's been asking around about the flood damage on the south side of the river," Abe said, still sorting. "Said Abbott knew Roy Pritchard, apparently, back before Roy settled here. Something about working together up in Kansas before Roy came down to farm." Lenora had not known that. Roy had rarely talked about his time in Kansas, which she had always assumed was simply because it was before her, before Maybelle, before the life that mattered to him. She was quiet for a moment. "That's so," she said. "Chester seemed to think Abbott might want to offer some help," Abe said. "I'm not saying what that means exactly because I don't know. I'm just saying the word that came through the store was that he's been asking." Lenora took her mail, which consisted of nothing she wanted to read, and went home. She thought about it for 3 days before she decided that pride, whatever its merits as a personal virtue, was not going to rebuild her barn or replant her fields. She wrote a letter. She rewrote it twice because the first 2 versions sounded either desperate or cold, and she wanted to sound like neither. The final version said simply that she understood he had perhaps known her late husband, that she was in considerable difficulty following the flood, and that if he had any capacity to assist, she would be grateful to discuss the matter and would of course expect to work out a proper arrangement for repayment in due time. She sent the letter with Abe Whitfield's postal service, and then went home and told herself she would not think about it until a reply came. She thought about it constantly. The reply arrived 8 days later and was considerably shorter than her letter. It said that he would come by the Pritchard place on Saturday morning if that was agreeable, and that there was no need to think about any arrangement for repayment at this time. It was signed Timothy Abbott in handwriting that was clear and direct without being elegant, the writing of a man who had learned to be functional rather than decorative. Lenora read it 4 times, then set it down, and told Maybelle they needed to make the kitchen presentable. Saturday came in bright and cool, one of those April mornings that the Oklahoma Territory produced sometimes after a brutally wet week, where the sky went a particular shade of blue that seemed to apologize for the previous day's behavior. Lenora had the coffee on and was in her yard pulling at pieces of debris when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up. Timothy Abbott was 34 years old, which Lenora only knew because Chester Keel had mentioned it to Abe Whitfield, who had mentioned it to practically everyone who came into the post office, because news of that nature traveled quickly in a small settlement. He was a broad-shouldered man with the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than any particular effort toward it, with dark brown hair that had some red in it when the sun hit it directly, and a face that was weathered in the way that outdoor men's faces were always weathered in that country, which was to say honest. He wore a brown coat over a work shirt, a well-used hat, and boots that had seen genuine mud rather than the decorative kind that some of the newer cattlemen affected. He swung down from his horse, a solid gray gelding, and he looked at the state of her property with an expression that was not pity exactly. It was something more like assessment combined with a kind of contained anger, the look of a person who understood what good work looked like and was troubled by seeing it destroyed. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, and he took his hat off, which she noted. "I'm Timothy Abbott." "I know," she said, and shook his hand. "Lenora Pritchard. Come inside, I have coffee." He tied his horse at the post she'd sunk beside the house and followed her in. She poured the coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table, and they looked at each other for a moment in the straightforward way that people in that country generally looked at each other, without much artifice, because life was too immediate for much artifice. "You knew Roy," she said. It was not quite a question. "I did," he said. "Not long and not deep, but I knew him. We worked the same cattle drive up near Wichita in '74. He was a good man to have beside you on a long drive. The kind that didn't complain when things went bad and didn't celebrate so loud when things went right that he made you nervous about tomorrow." He paused. "I was sorry to hear about the snake." "That's a bad way." "It is," Lenora agreed. They were quiet for a moment with that truth, and it was a comfortable quiet rather than an awkward one, which told Lenora something about Timothy Abbott that the letter had not. "I'd like to help," he said. "And before you tell me about repayment schedules and arrangements, let me say my piece." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, which was the gesture of a man settling himself for something honest. "I've done well up here. Better than I expected when I came down from Kansas. And I've been watching this flood tear up good people's work for going on 2 weeks, and there isn't enough a man can do about most of it. But this place I can do something about. Roy Pritchard was a decent man and he built something decent here, and I don't think it should fall to ruin because a river misbehaved. That's the whole of my reason." Lenora studied him. "That's a generous reason," she said carefully. "Maybe," he said, "but I mean it straight. There's no angle to it." She believed him. She had been widowed at 28 and had run this farm alone for 2 years, and she had learned very well how to tell when men had angles to things they were saying. Timothy Abbott did not appear to have an angle. He appeared to be a man who had decided something was right and was doing it. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I've got a good foreman," he said. "Chester Keel. He can run the ranch well enough without me looking over his shoulder for a month. I've been thinking on it, and a month is what it would take, with enough hands, to get you a new barn up and your fences repaired and your fields turned for a late planting. I'll bring 4 of my men with me. I'll cover the lumber and the supplies out of my own pocket, and I will not hear about repayment in any form because this is something I'm choosing to do." Lenora set her coffee cup down very carefully. "Mr. Abbott," she said. "Timothy," he said, "please." "Timothy," she said, and the name felt slightly unfamiliar in her mouth, like a word in a language she was just beginning to learn. "That is an extraordinary amount to offer." "It's a month of work," he said simply. "That's all." She was quiet for a moment. Maybelle appeared in the doorway from the back room, dark-eyed and curious, holding a cloth doll that had survived the flood because it had been in the bed. Timothy looked at the child and smiled, and it was an easy, uncomplicated smile without the slight stiffness that some men showed around children they did not know. "Hello," he said to Maybelle. "Hello," Maybelle said. "Are you going to fix our barn?" "I hope to," he said. Maybelle looked at him for a long moment with the severe evaluating expression that 7-year-olds deployed without self-consciousness. "Mama cried about the barn," she announced. "She did it at night when she thought I was sleeping, but I wasn't." "Maybelle," Lenora said quietly. "She did," Maybelle said, unapologetic. Timothy looked at Lenora, and there was something in his expression that was careful and kind, and not in the least bit condescending. "That seems about right to me," he said to Maybelle, "when something that important gets taken away." Maybelle apparently found this answer satisfactory and disappeared back into the room. Lenora looked at the table for a moment and then looked back at Timothy Abbott. "All right," she said. "I accept your help, thank you." He started the following Monday. He came with 4 ranch hands, as he had promised. A steady older man named Hector Ruiz, who had been working cattle since before the war, and could build almost anything from almost any material. A young man named Danny Fitch, who was perhaps 20 and enthusiastic in the way that young men sometimes were when given physical work to do. A quiet, broad fellow named Warren who communicated primarily through decisive action rather than conversation, and Chester Keel's younger brother Elias, who had been lent to the effort over Chester's mild objections and who turned out to be extremely capable with a hammer. The first week was almost entirely practical. Timothy had brought a wagon loaded with lumber from a mill in Guthrie, purchased at what Lenora suspected was considerably above what he had implied and below what he had actually paid. The lumber was good quality, straight-grained pine that Hector inspected with the professional approval of a man who had worked with inferior wood and knew what the difference looked like. They laid out the footprint of the new barn on the first morning, with Timothy and Hector doing the calculations together on a piece of paper, and then pacing the ground with a concentration that reminded Lenora of the way Roy used to plan his plantings, that specific focus that men who were good at physical work brought to any problem they were trying to solve correctly. Lenora worked alongside them. This was not what Timothy had expected, or at least it was not what he had planned for. He had expected, she could see, to manage a crew working on her behalf while she managed the house and the child. What he got instead was Lenora in her work dress and heavy gloves, hauling lumber and holding boards and asking direct questions about what went where and why. He adjusted to this quickly and without complaint, which she respected. By the end of the first week, the frame of the new barn was standing, and Lenora stood back and looked at it in the late afternoon light and felt something loosen in her chest that had been very tightly wound since the morning of the flood. "It's bigger than the old one," she said to Timothy, who was standing beside her with his hat pushed back and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow in the way of a man who had been working hard all day. "Little bit," he said. "Hector thought the original footprint was undersized for what you want to run eventually. I hope that's all right. We can adjust if—" "No," she said. "It's good, it's right." She paused. "Thank you." He looked at her sideways, and she noticed that his eyes were a dark gray-green that she had not been able to determine in the dimmer light of the kitchen that first morning. "You don't have to thank me every day," he said. "It makes me feel like you're keeping a ledger." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, because it had been a while since one had come out of her quite that easily. "I might be," she said. "Well, stop," he said, and he said it in a way that was not unkind but was very definite, and then he went back to work. She found over the days that followed that she did not quite stop watching him. This was not a thing she permitted herself to think about directly at first, because she had been very practical about her own life since Roy died, and practicality and watching a man sideways while he hammered roof joists were not obviously compatible. But she watched. She noticed the way he talked to his men, which was without condescension or performance, as if they were simply people engaged in a common problem together. She noticed the way he talked to Maybelle, which was with a seriousness that the child found enormously gratifying. Maybelle had largely decided that she liked Timothy Abbott by the end of the second day, which she communicated by following him around the work site asking questions until Lenora redirected her. "Does she bother you?" Lenora asked him one evening when the crew had ridden back to where they had set up camp in one of the dry pastures, and it was just the two of them on the porch while Maybelle slept inside. It was early May by then, warm enough to sit outside after supper without a coat. "No," he said, and he meant it. "She reminds me of a girl I knew growing up. My sister's youngest. She had that same quality of asking questions that were better than they sounded at first." "Maybelle's questions are always better than they sound," Lenora said, and then added, "Do you have family nearby?" "No, my family is mostly in Ohio. My parents are still there. I have 2 sisters and a brother, all settled with their own lives. I come from farming people originally, which is perhaps why I feel as I do about what the flood did here." "You left farming for cattle," she observed. "Farming didn't hold me," he said. "I don't know why exactly. I think I needed more country under me than one piece of land could give. Cattle driving let me see a great deal of this country before I settled on my own place." "Do you miss the driving?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she had noticed was something he did rather than giving the first answer that came to him. "Some days," he said. when the ranch feels small and still. But I'm past 30 now, and sleeping on the ground in all weather loses something of its appeal with the years." She smiled. "That seems sensible. What about you?" he asked. "This was always your plan. This land." Lenora looked out at the dark yard, the new barn frame against the sky. "It was Roy's plan first," she said. "We came down from Missouri when I was 21. Roy had found a way to buy these 30 acres at a price that meant we would work for years before we weren't in debt, but he believed in the land. He was right to. It's good soil." She paused. "I used to wonder sometimes if I'd have come here on my own without Roy. I don't know the answer, but I know that I'm not leaving, flood or no flood." "I believe that about you," he said. "Do you?" she said, and she looked at him. He looked back. "Yes," he said. "The first thing I noticed about this place when I rode in was that the house was clean. Not decorated. Clean. Someone had swept that porch recently, and the windows had been wiped. And I thought, a woman who does that after what she just lost is not a woman who is thinking about leaving." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "I did sweep that porch," she said. "The morning before you came. I don't know entirely why." "Because it was yours," he said simply. She did not answer that, but she thought about it for a long time after she went inside. The second week brought the fencing work, which was slower and more difficult than the barn framing had been, because the flood had not simply knocked down Lenora's fences, but had in several places removed the ground itself, eroding the bank where the posts had been sunk, and leaving jagged raw earth that needed to be reworked before posts could go back in. Hector and Warren handled the most technical portions, while Timothy and Elias and Danny worked the longer straight runs of fence across the upper pastures. Lenora worked alongside them, driving staples and stretching wire, and by the end of the second week her hands were sore in a way she found satisfying. It was during the fence work that she and Timothy fell into the habit of riding together at the end of each day to assess what had been accomplished. It began practically, as a way of organizing the next day's work, and became something else so gradually that Lenora did not notice the transition until it had already happened. They would ride out to the far south pasture and then curve north along the ridge, and they would talk. They talked about the land, about the state of the territorial cattle market, about the ongoing push by various interests to formalize the territorial government, about Roy, occasionally, in the careful way of people handling something fragile. They talked about Timothy's ranch, the Cimarron Bend spread, which was what people had started calling it even though that wasn't its official name. "What do you actually call it?" she asked him one evening near the end of the second week. The sun was going down in long horizontal bands of orange and pink that were extravagant even by Oklahoma standards. "I call it home," he said, "which I recognize is not a name. That's a better answer than most men would give." "Most men I know name their ranches after themselves," he said. "The Abbott Ranch. I find that a little thin as a gesture toward immortality. I'd rather just do something that lasts." She looked at him. The fading light was doing something complicated to his face, the kind of thing that evening light did in that country, and she was aware of a tightening in her chest that she recognized from a long time ago, from when she was a young woman in Missouri before Roy, before all of it. She looked away at the horizon. "You're a thoughtful man, Timothy Abbott," she said. "I'm a slow man," he corrected. "It comes to the same thing sometimes, but not always." "No," she said. "Thoughtful." He said nothing, but she heard him shift slightly in his saddle, and when she looked back, he was looking at the sunset rather than at her, with an expression she could not entirely read, but that seemed to her to be a man choosing his footing carefully. They rode back to the house in a quiet that was easier than most conversations. The third week brought the fields, which was perhaps the most daunting of the tasks, because the flood had not merely churned the surface of the soil, but had deposited a layer of river silt in the lower third of the farmable acreage that needed to be turned under and worked before anything could be planted. It was backbreaking work, and Danny Fitch, who had been cheerfully enthusiastic about the carpentry and fence work, looked at the field situation with an expression of carefully concealed dismay. Timothy set him to work on the upper portion, where the damage was less severe, and worked the lower portion himself, alongside Hector and Lenora. It was during one of these long mornings in the field that Lenora made her error. She had been working the same furrow for 2 hours, following behind the plow that Warren was guiding with the steady horse, picking out the larger rocks and pieces of debris that the river had deposited. She was tired, more tired than she had been willing to admit, because she had been sleeping poorly. Not because of worry, or not only because of worry, but because she had been lying awake in her repaired house listening to the sounds of the camp down in the lower pasture, and thinking about things she was not ready to think about clearly. She was tired, and she was not paying proper attention, and she caught her boot on a buried root that the flood had deposited and went down hard on the rocky soil. She was upright again almost instantly, because reflexes and pride both demanded it. But she had gone down on her right hand, and the palm was bleeding from the gravel, and she said something under her breath that she would not have said in front of Maybelle. Timothy was beside her before she had time to process how he had gotten there. He had been 30 yards away, which meant he had moved very quickly, and he was taking her hand in both of his with a directness that did not feel presumptuous, but felt, oddly, like exactly the right response to the situation. "It's nothing," she said immediately. "I see that," he said, in a tone that indicated he saw no such thing. He turned her hand over carefully, examining the palm. The cuts were not deep, but they were several and gritty with dirt. "Come to the water." She let him lead her to the water barrel at the edge of the field, which she recognized as somewhat unlike her. He cleaned her hand with careful efficiency, using his bandana, which was clean because he had used a fresh one that morning. He was very close to her while he did this, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him and smell the honest smell of a man who had been working in the sun all morning. She looked at his hands, which were larger than hers, darker from the weather, with a long scar across the left one that she had not noticed before. "What is that from?" she asked, meaning the scar. He looked up from her hand and then looked down again. "Wire a few years back. My own fault for moving too fast." He finished wrapping his bandana around her palm with an awkward, careful knot. "That will do until you can get the house." She looked at the bandana, which was pale blue. She looked up at his face, which was very close. He was looking at her hand still, not at her face, and she thought that was deliberate, and she thought she understood why. "Timothy," she said, and her voice came out differently than she intended it to, quieter and more open. He looked at her then. They were very close together in the bright May sun, with the smell of turned earth around them and the sounds of the working men 30 yards away, and Lenora felt something that she had been managing very carefully for the better part of 2 weeks come loose in her chest and press against her ribs from the inside. She stepped back, not quickly, not as if she was afraid, but with deliberateness. "Thank you," she said, and she meant the hand. "Of course," he said, and he also stepped back, and then he turned and went back to work in the field. That evening she did not suggest the evening ride, and he did not suggest it either. They ate supper on the porch with Maybelle between them, and the three of them talked about inconsequential things: the progress of the planting, whether the spotted horse that had survived the flood had any particular gift for being underfoot, whether the mockingbird that had taken up residence in the cottonwood by the smokehouse was the same one that had been there the previous year. It was easy and pleasant, and there was something between them that had not been there before, something cautious and significant, like an ember someone has cupped their hands around to protect. Maybelle fell asleep on the porch bench with her head on Lenora's lap, which happened sometimes when the evenings were warm and the conversation was comfortable. Lenora sat with her hand in the child's hair and looked out at the dark and said, after a while, "Roy would be grateful for what you're doing here." "I'm not doing it for Roy," Timothy said. He said it quietly but without apology. The silence that followed was long and full of things neither of them said yet. "I know that," Lenora said, finally. He looked at her. The moon was rising and the light was silver and strange. "Is that all right?" he asked, and the question was the most careful thing she had heard from him yet, the most deliberate, The question of a man who understood that the answer mattered enormously and was prepared to hear either version of it. Lenora thought about Roy, whom she had loved deeply and lost with a grief that had taken more than a year to become survivable. She thought about the farm and the flood and the 30 acres of soil that she had chosen and fought for. She thought about the way Timothy looked at Maybelle with that uncomplicated, easy seriousness. She thought about the pale blue bandana around her hand. "I think it might be," she said. Neither of them said anything else. But the ember between them was considerably warmer by the time she carried Maybelle inside. The following days had a quality to them that Lenora could not have accurately described to anyone, and did not try to. The work continued, and it was good work, and the farm was visibly becoming itself again, the barn taking its new larger shape against the spring sky, the fences straight and sound across the pastures, the fields turned and planted with the late sorghum, and corn that Hector had suggested as the most sensible option for the shortened growing season. But alongside the work there was this other thing, this careful unfolding thing between herself and Timothy Abbott, and she paid attention to it the way she paid attention to everything that mattered, steadily and without drama. He began small things. He found a way each morning to speak to her privately for 5 minutes before the crew arrived, usually over the first cup of coffee, asking about the night and the plans for the day in a manner that was practical on its surface and something else entirely underneath. He made a point of noticing what she noticed. The way the late planting was coming in on the upper pasture, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon that made the new barn look like it had been there forever. He was careful with her space and careful with her daughter, and both of those things mattered to Lenora in ways she did not need to explain out loud. One afternoon, near the middle of the 3rd week, they were working on the last section of south fence when Danny Fitch, who was young enough and unsophisticated enough to say things that older people would have kept to themselves, said to Elias in what he clearly imagined was a low voice, "You think the boss and Mrs. Pritchard are sweet on each other," Elias said in a voice that was also not quite as low as he perhaps intended. "I think that's the most obviously true thing you've said in 3 weeks, son." Lenora did not look at Timothy. She could feel him not looking at her with the same concentrated effort. Then she heard a sound from him that was unmistakably a suppressed laugh. She pressed her lips together. "Daniel," Timothy said, his voice very even, "that post needs to go 4 inches deeper." "Yes, sir," said Daniel, with the chastened speed of a young man who was not sorry at all. That evening Lenora laughed until she had tears at the corners of her eyes while she was washing the supper dishes, quietly enough that Maybelle, already in bed, would not hear. Timothy was still on the porch, and she could hear him laughing as well, and the sound of it moved through the walls of the house and settled somewhere in her center with a warmth she had forgotten was possible. She dried her hands and went back to the porch. He was leaning back against the porch post with his arms folded and an expression of tremendous dignity that was slightly undone by the lingering evidence of the laugh. 4 inches deeper, she said. "It needed to be deeper," he said. "Of course it did." They looked at each other, and the lamplight from the window fell across the boards between them, and it was the closest they had been without the excuse of proximity to work, and Lenora could feel the shift in the air the way she could sometimes feel the change in weather before the sky showed it. "Lenora," he said, and her name in his voice had a different quality than she had noticed before, something undisguised in it. "Timothy," she said. He unfolded his arms and took 2 steps toward her, not quickly, giving her the full length of each step to move if she wanted to. She stood still. He stopped when he was close enough that she could see the particular deep color of his eyes in the dim light, gray-green and very serious. "I did not come here planning on this," he said. "I want you to know that. I came because it was right to come, and what happened after is something different entirely, and I'm not sure I have a way to make that sound better than it does." "It sounds honest," she said. "That's better." He reached out and took her hand, the right one with the healing cuts on the palm, the one he had cleaned in the field. He held it carefully. "I don't know what to do with this yet," he said. "Exactly, I don't want to step wrong." "You haven't," she said. "I want to be sure," he said. "That's all. I've been sure about very little in my life besides the land and the cattle, and I find that with this I want to be surer than I've been about anything." She turned her hand over in his and held it properly, fingers between fingers, which was a declaration of its own kind. "Then be sure," she said. "There's time." He looked at their hands and then at her face. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was old-fashioned and perhaps not what the rough and ready cowboys of the Oklahoma Territory generally did, but which felt entirely right for Timothy Abbott, who was, she had come to understand, a man more careful and more old-fashioned at heart than his trail-driving past might have suggested. "Thank you," he said, meaning something much larger than the words. "You say that too much," she said, and she smiled. He smiled back. It was the fullest smile she had seen from him, with no reservation in it, and it changed his face in a way that made her chest do something extraordinary. "Good night, Lenora," he said. "Good night, Timothy," she said. He walked back to his camp, and she stood on the porch for a long while in the warm dark, holding the hand he had kissed against her chest, not thinking about anything complicated. Just standing in the night and listening to the creek and the mockingbird in the cottonwood and the quiet breathing of her land coming back to life. The fourth week began with a development that nobody had planned for. Chester Keel arrived on Monday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound apology, having ridden down from the Cimarron Bend ranch in what had clearly been considerable haste. He found Timothy in the barn where the interior fittings were being installed, the stall dividers and the hay loft and the tack room that Hector had designed with the precision of a man who took storage seriously. "Boss," Chester said, "I'm sorry to bring this down here." Timothy turned from the stall divider he was measuring. "What is it?" "We've got a fence dispute," Chester said, "with the Hargrove people." Lenora, who was in the barn organizing the tack room, did not mean to listen. She was, however, close enough to hear clearly. "Hargrove," Timothy said. There was a flatness to his voice that she had not heard before. "His men came up to the north property line yesterday and told our boys that the flood had shifted the marker stakes on the property line and that he's claiming an additional 50 yards of our grazing on that side." Chester rubbed the back of his neck. "Our boys held their ground, but there were words said that I won't repeat, and I'm worried that by Friday someone's going to do something stupid." Timothy was quiet for a moment. Lenora had heard of the Hargrove family. They were a significant landowning force in the northern part of the territory, the kind of operation that had grown large not exclusively through honest means, and the kind of people who saw a neighbor's inconvenience as a potential opportunity. "Are the marker stakes actually shifted?" Timothy asked. "Hard to say," Chester said. "The flood hit up there too, not as bad as down here, but the creek did some moving. Our original survey papers should show it clear enough." "Where are the survey papers?" "In the strongbox at the ranch office." Timothy looked at the stall divider. Lenora could see him calculating, and she could see what the calculation was costing him, and she made a decision quickly, the way she made most of her important decisions without letting herself deliberate past the obvious. She came out of the tack room. Both men looked at her. "Go," she said to Timothy. He opened his mouth. "Go," she repeated. "This is your land and your livelihood. The barn interior can wait a week. The fencing is done. The fields are planted. Maybelle and I are fine." She looked at him steadily. "Go deal with the Hargrove situation before it becomes something that can't be dealt with quietly." Chester looked at Timothy with the expression of a man who was very relieved. "I'll leave Hector and Warren," Timothy said. "You don't need to." "I'm leaving them," he said, and his tone made it clear this was not a negotiable point. 2 days, he said to Chester. "Let me get the papers organized and speak to Hargrove directly. If that doesn't settle it, we may need the territorial surveyor, but let's try the direct conversation first." "Yes, sir," Chester said. Timothy turned back to Lenora. They were standing in the half-finished barn, with the smell of new pine around them and the sounds of the other men working outside. He looked at her in a way that was entirely private, entirely just between them, and said, I'll be back by Wednesday. I'll be here, she said. He left within the hour, riding north with Chester, and Lenora stood in the doorway of the new barn and watched him go with a feeling she had not anticipated, which was the simple, honest feeling of missing a person before they had even fully disappeared from sight. Hector and Warren continued to work on the barn interior, and Lenora worked with them, and she told herself that 2 days was a very short time. Maybelle, upon being told that Timothy had gone to deal with something at his ranch, said, "When is he coming back?" with a directness that said more than Maybelle knew she was saying. "Wednesday," Lenora told her. "Day after tomorrow." Maybelle accepted this and went back to the cloth doll, and Lenora accepted it too, and Tuesday was a long day. He came back Tuesday evening, a full day earlier than he had said. She heard the horse on the road and went to the porch, not running, walking, because she was 30 years old and not 17. He dismounted at the post and looked at her across the yard with an expression that was tired and satisfied and something else. "Did you resolve it?" she asked. "We did," he said. He came up to the porch. Hargrove backed down when I showed him the original survey and reminded him that the Territorial Land Office keeps their own copies and would be happy to clarify things officially. "He's a bully with people who have less paper than he does." "And you had paper," she said. "I had a very organized foreman," he said, and he sat down on the porch step and leaned back against the post with the posture of a man who had ridden hard and was glad to be still. Lenora sat beside him, which she would not have done a week earlier without more conscious thought. She sat beside him because it was where she wanted to be. "I missed this place," he said, looking out at the dark farm. "You were gone one day," she said. "I know," he said. He looked at her. "I missed this place." She understood what he meant by this place. "The tack room is nearly finished," she said. "Hector built a saddle rack that you would approve of. Did he put in the extra peg for the martingales?" "He did. I told him you would ask about that." He looked at her with an expression of quiet delight. "You told him I would ask about that. You mentioned it twice when we were planning the room," she said. "I was listening." "You always are," he said, and it was not a question, and it was not a small thing. She looked down at the step between them and then back up at his face. "Timothy," she said, "I want to say something directly." "Say it," he said. "I have been alone for 2 years," she said, "and I have managed, and I do not need to not be alone. I want you to understand that. I have my daughter and my land, and I know how to run them both. I'm not telling you this because I am desperate or because I am grateful for what you've done here. Though I am grateful, I'll always be grateful." She stopped. "Go on," he said. "I am telling you that what has happened here between us over this month, that is not gratitude and it is not loneliness. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me that you understand the difference." He looked at her very carefully. "I understand the difference," he said, "and I want to say something directly back." "Say it," she said, with a small, unguarded smile at the echo. "I have also been alone," he said. "Not from grief, which is a harder thing than simple solitude, but from choice, because nothing and no one had seemed sufficiently important to change that state. And I came here because it was right and because of Roy Pritchard and because of 30 acres of good land that deserved better than the river gave it. And then I met you." He stopped. He looked at the yard. "And I find that this is the most important thing I have done in my adult life. Being here, working this place with you. Talking to you in the evening, watching you decide things." He looked back at her. "I find that I am not willing to go back to before any of this." Lenora looked at him. She looked at him for a long time in the comfortable manner that they had established between them, direct and unafraid. "Then don't," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was a first kiss in the way that first kisses only sometimes were, full of the accumulated weight of everything that had led to it, careful and warm and completely honest. She put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of it, and kissed him back with all the steadiness she had in her, which was a considerable amount. When they parted, he was very close, and his eyes were darker than usual, and his expression was something she had never seen before on any man, a kind of wondering satisfaction that came from a person who had not quite believed something would happen and now found it had. "Lenora," he said, "I know," she said. They sat on the porch for another 2 hours that night, talking and quiet by turns, and at no point did either of them try to make it into anything more complicated than it was, which was two people who had come to a clear and mutual understanding on a Tuesday evening in May in the Oklahoma Territory, with the mockingbird singing in the cottonwood. The last days of the month came quickly. Elias and Danny rode back to the Cimarron Bend ranch at the end of the third week, their portion of the work done, with Lenora's genuine thanks and a jar of preserved peaches each, which she had found in the stone smokehouse, one of the things the flood had not reached. Hector and Warren finished the barn interior on the first day of the fourth week, and Hector spent an afternoon simply inspecting every inch of the structure with the thoroughness of a craftsman satisfying himself that his work would stand. He declared it sound, which was the highest possible praise from Hector, and shook Lenora's hand when he left. Warren, who spoke very little, paused at the gate on his way out and said to Lenora, in what was probably the longest sentence she had heard from him, "Good piece of land. Be ashamed to let a river take it." Then he got on his horse and rode after Hector. It was the last Sunday of the month, and it was warm and still, and the new barn sat solid and right against the spring sky, and the fences ran straight and tight across the pastures, and the field on the upper portion was showing the faint hairline of new green growth where the late sorghum was coming in. The lower field would need another week or two, but Hector had said it would come, and Lenora trusted Hector's assessment of soil the way she trusted the almanac. Timothy was supposed to leave Monday morning. He was supposed to ride back to Cimarron Bend and Chester Keel's stewardship and the cattle that had been waiting a month without him, and take up his proper life again. Sunday evening, Maybelle went to bed early and without protest, which was unusual enough that Lenora looked at her daughter with slight suspicion. Maybelle's expression was entirely innocent, which was even more suspicious. Lenora tucked her in and went back to the porch. Timothy was standing in the yard looking at the barn. She came down the porch steps and stood beside him, and they looked at the barn together in the last of the evening light. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. They were quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly and not say yes simply because the month is ending and it might seem like the natural thing." "I will answer it honestly," she said. "That is the only kind of answer I give." He turned to face her. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to come back here on Saturdays and take you and Maybelle to church if you'll have it, and have supper on this porch, and meet every person in this territory who matters to you and be met by them. I want to do this the right way." He paused. "And I want you to know that the right way, in my mind, ends with asking you to marry me. Not today, because we have not known each other long enough for that question to be asked yet. But I want to be honest about where I am pointed." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. A warm evening wind moved through the yard, touching the leaves of the cottonwood. "Timothy Abbott," she said, "that is the most organized declaration of intent I have ever heard in my life." He blinked. Then he laughed and she laughed with him, and the laughter moved between them like something natural and inevitable. "Is that a yes?" he said when they had recovered. "That is a yes," she said. "Come on Saturdays. Come more than Saturdays if you can. This place could use more of your company, and so could I." He took her hand and held it, and they stood in the yard of the repaired farm in the soft May evening, and Lenora felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time, which was the specific, grounded pleasure of the present moment being exactly right. The courtship that followed was, as Timothy had promised, proper. He came on Saturdays and often on a second day of the week if the ranch could spare him. He arrived in a clean shirt and with something in hand, sometimes a small practical thing like a good leather hinge for the barn door that he had found in Guthrie, sometimes a book that he thought Lenora might like, because it turned out that Timothy Abbott was a man who read, which Lenora found unexpectedly appealing. He met the women of the Presbyterian congregation, who regarded him with the combined scrutiny of people who had genuine affection for Lenora and genuine curiosity, about any man who appeared in her orbit. He submitted to this scrutiny with good humor and answered every question directly, and within 3 Sundays had earned what passed for provisional approval from the church circle, which was considerably faster than most men managed. He met Abe Whitfield, who shook his hand and said, "So you're the one that built her barn," in a tone that made it clear that barn building was an effective introduction. He met the 2 neighboring families, the Garveys to the west and the Tullows family to the north, both of whom had suffered their own flood damage and were in the process of their own rebuildings, and who received Timothy with the warm pragmatism of people who needed all the good neighbors they could find. Maybelle, for her part, conducted her own investigation into Timothy Abbott's suitability with a thoroughness that would have done credit to a territorial judge. She asked him about his horses by name, and he told her. She asked him whether he had ever read the Swiss Family Robinson, and he had. She asked him whether he intended to be around for a long time or just visiting, and he said, in his direct way, that he intended to be around for a very long time if her mother would permit it. And Maybelle had looked at him for a full 10 seconds and then said, "All right," and gone back to her book with the air of a matter satisfactorily settled. June came in, and the late sorghum grew, and the Oklahoma Territory summer arrived with all the force it generally mustered, which was considerable. Lenora worked her fields in the morning cool and rested in the afternoon heat, and managed the debt payment to the Guthrie Bank on schedule, which she had been able to do because the late planting was coming well, and because Timothy, in an act of quiet efficiency, had sent Chester Keel down with 3 young steers in early June, saying that the flood had clearly taken livestock she could not readily replace, and that these 3 were from surplus stock and she should not argue about it. She had argued about it for exactly 1 letter, and then accepted the steers and added them to her inventory, because they were young and sound and her land could support them. She and Timothy wrote letters in the weeks between his visits. This was, she found, one of the unexpected pleasures of knowing him, that he wrote well and honestly, and with a specific attention to detail that made his letters feel like conversations rather than bulletins. He described the state of his cattle and the behavior of the Cimarron Bend pastures and the ongoing territorial political situation, which was moving toward formal statehood with the grinding slowness of all large governmental processes, and he asked her questions that required real answers, not pleasantries. She wrote back at length about the farm and Maybelle and the neighbors and the mockingbird and the cottonwood, and occasionally about things she did not usually say out loud, thoughts about Roy and the flood and the nature of starting over, and he answered those parts of her letters with a care that she had come to depend on in a way that no longer frightened her. In July, on a Saturday when the heat was extreme even by territorial standards, and they had retreated to the porch with cold water from the well and all 3 of them were in a state of pleasant suspended animation, Timothy said to Maybelle, with the particular seriousness he reserved for conversations with her, "Maybelle, I would like your opinion on something." Maybelle looked up from the book she was reading, which was entirely too advanced for 7 years old but which she was clearly making her way through with determination. "What?" she said. "I am going to ask your mother to marry me," he said. "I wanted to ask whether you had any objections first." Maybelle considered this with enormous gravity. Lenora had gone completely still in her chair. "Would we move to your ranch?" Maybelle asked. "Or I could move here," Timothy said. "Chester Keel is capable of running the ranch with oversight and the ranch is close enough to ride. Either way is something we'd all decide together. Would you still read Swiss Family Robinson?" "I finished my copy," he said, "but I believe in rereading good things." Maybelle appeared to complete her deliberations. "I don't have objections," she said, and went back to her book with the composure of a person who had been expecting this development and had prepared accordingly. Lenora looked at Timothy. Timothy looked at Lenora. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small, which was a ring, a simple gold band with a small dark red garnet, which was not the most expensive thing in the territory but was well made, and, she would later learn, had belonged to his grandmother in Ohio, and had been sent to him by his mother at some unspecified point at which she had apparently decided her bachelor son might eventually find use for it. He went down on one knee on the porch boards, which he did without ceremony or particular self-consciousness, as if it was simply the appropriate physical response to the moment. "Lenora," he said, "I have been careful my whole life and I don't regret it because it has brought me to this porch and to you. I love you. I love your daughter and your land and your iron, which is what I call the particular quality in you that swept a flooded porch the morning before I arrived. I would like to spend the rest of my life being certain about this, which is the only kind of certain I believe in." He held the ring up. "Will you marry me?" Lenora looked at the ring. She looked at the man on one knee on her repaired porch. She looked at Maybelle, who was not reading the book at all but was watching with transparent attention. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He stood and put the ring on her finger, and she took his face in both her hands and kissed him thoroughly, which was the kind of kiss that needed no more ceremony than itself. Maybelle made a sound from behind her book that was either approval or mild disgust, and neither of them cared which. They were married in September in the Presbyterian Church in Colton's Crossing on a day that the territory provided, as if it had been ordered, clear and cool and golden in the way that early fall sometimes was in that country. The church was full, because Lenora Pritchard was genuinely liked in the community and Timothy Abbott had made a good impression over the summer months, and because a wedding in a small settlement was something everyone turned out for. Abe Whitfield sat in the third row with his wife. The Garveys and the Tullows family occupied adjacent pews. Chester Keel came down from the ranch dressed in his best with his hat in his hand, and his expression of a man who had known this was coming for quite some time. Hector Ruiz was there, sitting with Warren in the back, both of them cleaned up in a manner that spoke of considerable effort. Danny Fitch, who had apparently told everyone he knew about the wedding in the weeks preceding it, was there with his boots polished and his collar too tight. Maybelle walked up the aisle first, carrying a bunch of late sunflowers tied with a piece of yellow ribbon that Lenora had cut from the hem of an old curtain. She did this with the grave processional dignity of a child who had thought carefully about how to do it well. Then Lenora came, in a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, working on it in the evenings after Maybelle slept, and she walked without being given away by anyone because she was a widow and a property owner and a woman who had held her own land for years and did not require giving. She walked up the aisle of that church toward Timothy Abbott, who was standing at the front in a dark coat that fit him properly, and with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who had never expected to be so entirely certain about anything. The vows were the traditional ones, the word and honor of the Presbyterian form that she had made once before and was making again, and she meant every syllable of them with every piece of herself she had. They received their friends afterward in the churchyard, where tables had been set up with food contributed by half the settlement, because that was how things were done in communities that understood each other. Timothy shook hands and Lenora accepted embraces, and Maybelle ate 3 pieces of cake without anyone telling her not to, which was one of the privileges of the day. Chester Keel caught Timothy's arm at one point and said, in a voice of quiet and genuine affection, "I always figured you'd find her eventually. I just didn't figure it would take a flood." "It took whatever it needed to," Timothy said. "That's true of most things," Chester said, and shook his hand again. In the weeks following the wedding, they worked out the practical questions with the same directness that they brought to everything. The ranch was 4 miles north of the Pritchard farm. Chester could run the day-to-day with oversight, and Timothy could ride between the two places with the ease of a man who was accustomed to covering country on horseback. They decided, after considerable discussion with Maybelle's input duly received, that they would keep both properties but make the farm the primary home, because the farm was Lenora's, and because the farm's soil was something particular that neither of them wanted to surrender. Timothy hired on a reliable man named Joseph Rays to assist Chester at the ranch and adjusted Chester's pay upward to reflect the increased responsibility, which Chester received with appropriate dignity and no false modesty. The farm became a combined operation, with Lenora's crop work and Timothy's cattle knowledge, forming a small but growing mixed enterprise that, by the following spring, was generating enough income to eliminate the Guthrie Bank debt in a single payment, which Lenora mailed in person on a cold February morning, and then stood outside the Guthrie post office feeling something she recognized as the specific texture of relief that comes when a thing you have carried for years is finally put down. The winter between the wedding and that February was the warmest interior winter Lenora could remember, not in temperature but in the quality of the evenings and the mornings, in the specific pleasure of a house that was no longer still and solitary but had a fullness to it. Timothy filled space the way the right objects fill a room, not by crowding it but by making it complete. He made coffee in the mornings without being asked, and remembered how she took hers. He read after supper by the lamp, and sometimes read aloud if he found something worth sharing. He was patient with Maybelle's questions and thorough in answering them, which Maybelle responded to by becoming increasingly encyclopedic in her subject matter. There was a cold night in December when the temperature fell so sharply that ice formed on the inside of the window glass, which happened sometimes in the territory despite the general mildness of its winters, and Lenora woke in the dark to the cold and lay listening to the house. Timothy was asleep beside her with the deep and uncomplicated sleep of a man who had worked hard and had a clear conscience, and she lay and listened to the house around them, the familiar sounds of the wood settling and the wind in the cottonwood, and somewhere outside the distant sound of coyotes, and she thought about all the nights she had lain in this same house alone in the dark, managing. And she thought that managing was not the same as living, and that she had been managing for 2 years and was now, definitively, living. She put her head back down and went asleep. Spring came to the farm in 1883 with a generosity that seemed, to the people who had been there the previous spring, like a kind of apology. The Cimarron stayed in its banks. The planting went in on schedule and came in well. Timothy's cattle turned a good profit at the fall market in Caldwell, Kansas, and Lenora's fields produced a yield that allowed her to expand the late planting in a way that suggested the following year could be even better. The farm had evolved from what Roy had built into something slightly different, but no less genuine, a living thing that had been hurt and had grown back different and stronger, the way things did when they were properly tended. Maybelle, now 8, was reading things that her schoolteacher occasionally raised an eyebrow at, and had decided she wanted to learn to ride properly, which Timothy undertook with the combination of seriousness and patience that he brought to everything involving Maybelle, getting her started on a small, calm mare that had come with the ranch herd, and had the temperament of a particularly philosophical older woman. Within a month, Maybelle could walk and trot without assistance. Within 2 months she could canter, and her expression when she cantered was one of pure, uncomplicated joy that made both Lenora and Timothy stop what they were doing and watch. In late October of 1883, Lenora told Timothy, on a Sunday morning when the kitchen was full of the smell of coffee and the last of the fall light, that they were expecting a child. She said it without preamble because that was how she said everything, and she watched his face. He sat down. He had been standing at the stove, and he sat down in the chair beside her and looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and pressed them and did not say anything for almost a full minute, which she understood was not the absence of response but the fullness of it. "A child," he said. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." "Maybelle," he said. "We should tell her." "I know," she said. "In a moment." He stood up and came around the table and held her against him with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she could feel the steady hard beat of his heart against her back, and she closed her eyes and let herself be held by this man who had come to her on a gray April morning on a good horse with 4 workers and a wagon load of lumber and had stayed. Mabel's response to the news was characteristically her own. She thought about it for several minutes, during which time she asked 3 clarifying questions about the nature and timeline of the situation, and then said, "Will it talk much?" She appeared less concerned with the emotional dimension of the news than with the practical implications for the household. "Not for a while," Timothy told her. "They start small." "I know that," Mabel said, as if he had said something obvious. "I mean later." "Later is hard to predict," he said. Mabel seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. "I suppose I can help," she said, with the modest magnanimity of someone conferring a significant benefit, and went back to her book. The child was born in April of 1884, as predicted, in the same house where Lenora had already lived through a great deal of history. He was born on a morning when the cottonwood outside was just beginning its first light green of the new year, and he announced himself with a considerable voice that Timothy, who was in the room because Lenora had told him firmly that she wanted him there, and because he was not a man who argued with Lenora when she was firm about things, described afterward as determined. The woman from town who assisted at the birth, Mrs. Garvey's sister Ada, who had some midwifery training, laughed and said all healthy boys sounded like that. He was a boy, and they named him James Roy Abbott, the James for Timothy's father in Ohio, and the Roy for the man who had first broken this soil, and built the first barn that the river had taken, because it seemed right to Lenora that Roy Pritchard's name stay on this land in some form, and Timothy had said so before she even asked. James Roy Abbott came into the world with his father's broad build in miniature, and over the following weeks began to manifest Lenora's dark eyes, which pleased her. He ate with enthusiasm and slept in intermittent enthusiastic bursts, and grew at the rate that healthy children in that country generally grew, which was to say rapidly and with great conviction. Timothy's parents came from Ohio that summer to meet their daughter-in-law and grandchildren, because Timothy had written them a letter in January that had apparently, according to the response, moved his mother to considerable tears of the happy variety. His father, a man named George Abbott, who was quietly intense in the way Timothy was quietly intense, and who had the same habit of thinking before speaking, walked every acre of the farm with Timothy on the first day and said at the end of it, "Good soil." His mother, Lenora Abbott, held James Roy with the practiced ease of a grandmother who had other grandchildren, and looked at Lenora with the frank, warm assessment of a woman who had been waiting to meet her son's wife and was satisfied with what she found. "He wrote about you in October," Lenora told Lenora, while they were in the kitchen and the men were on the porch. "That first letter. He wrote about the flood and the barn and the farm, and then he wrote, and I remember this exactly, that he had met a woman of remarkable substance. That is the phrase he used." "Remarkable substance," Lenora said, raising her eyebrows slightly. "I knew from that," Lenora said, with a smile that was Timothy's smile on an older face, "that he was entirely gone." Mabel, who was by now 9 and had evolved from provisional acceptance of Timothy to something considerably warmer over the months, received his parents with the formal courtesy of a child who had been raised to have good manners and the underlying warmth of a child who was, at last, part of a larger family. She called them Mr. and Mrs. Abbott for approximately a day and a half before George Abbott, who it turned out was entirely undone by children and had always been so, asked her if she might be willing to call him something easier, and she looked at him for a moment and said, "Grandfather George," which was neither of the options he had been expecting, but which he accepted with evident delight. The weeks after Timothy's parents left had a quality that was hard to name but easy to feel. The farm was settled and running. The combined enterprise of farm and cattle was genuinely profitable in a modest way, which in 1884 in the Oklahoma Territory was something to be grateful for and not to be taken for granted. The land payments were done. The bank in Guthrie had no claim on the Pritchard, now Abbott, farm. James Roy was 3 months old and expressing vigorous opinions about the world from his blanket. Maybelle was riding her mare with a confidence that had moved Timothy from proud to actively impressed. One evening in August, warm and still with the last of the day's heat in the boards of the porch, Lenora and Timothy sat after supper in the familiar way of people who had been together long enough that silence was comfortable rather than empty. James Roy was asleep inside. Maybelle had gone to bed at sunset, claimed by a long day of riding. The mockingbird in the cottonwood was doing what it did every evening, which was produce an improbable repertoire of other birds' songs with an enthusiasm that seemed personal. "Do you ever think about that first morning?" Timothy said. Lenora looked at the cottonwood. "Which first morning?" "The one when I rode in," he said. "April of last year." "I was in the yard pulling debris," she said. "I had not slept particularly well." "You had on a blue work dress," he said, "and you were not going to let the flood win. I could see that from the road." She looked at him. "You could see that from the road." "I could see that from the road," he said, "before I even got to the gate. I thought, whoever this woman is, she is not going to let this beat her." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "I was not certain of that myself at the time," she said. "I was certain," he said, "for both of us." She reached over and took his hand, the left one with the wire scar, and held it in her lap. The evening moved around them, the cottonwood leaves turning in the warm air, the mockingbird cycling through its repertoire, the farm quiet and whole around them, the new barn solid against the purple sky. "Timothy," she said. "Lenora," he said. "I swept the porch that morning because I was afraid," she said. "I want you to know that. The iron you keep talking about, I felt it cracking that week before you came. When I swept that porch, I was not being brave. I was holding on to the only thing I could control." He turned his hand over in hers and held it. "That's exactly what brave is," he said. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she thought about the flood, and the debris-strewn yard, and the letter she had written and rewritten twice, and the gray gelding on the road, and the pale blue bandana, and the first kiss on the porch in the dark, and the ring that had been his grandmother's, and the church in September and the full pews, and the particular weight of James Roy in her arms that first morning, and the sound of Maybelle at full canter on her mare with joy all over her face. "I suppose it is," she said. The territorial years moved forward, as years did. The following winter was mild and productive. The spring planting of 1885 went in early and came up strong, and Lenora expanded into a small kitchen garden along the south side of the house that produced tomatoes, squash, and enough sweet corn to trade at the general store. Timothy's Cimarron Bend ranch continued to prosper under Chester Keel's steady management, and Timothy rode up twice a week to oversee and consult, and Chester's capability grew with the responsibility in the way that capable men generally grew when they were trusted. There was a moment in the summer of 1885 that Lenora returned to in memory more than once over the years, a simple moment that nonetheless had the quality of the important ones. She was in the garden in the early morning, and the light was low and golden, and she could hear Timothy in the barn, talking to the horses in the easy, quiet way he talked to them, and she could hear Maybelle in the kitchen making more noise than was strictly necessary for whatever she was doing, and she could hear James Roy, now 15 months and walking with considerable conviction and no particular direction, on the porch behind her saying his developing vocabulary at the yard. All of these sounds were simultaneous and ordinary and entirely specific to this moment and this life, and Lenora paused in her garden with her hands in the warm dirt and simply listened to them all at once, the way you sometimes paused in a piece of music to hear all the parts separately before the melody continued. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because a flood had brought her here, or because Roy had built it first, or because Timothy Abbott had ridden in on a gray gelding in April, though all of those things were true. She was exactly where she was supposed to be because she had swept the porch and written the letter and chosen the blue dress, and said yes on a porch in the moonlight, and yes again in the Presbyterian church in September, and yes, continuously, to all of it, to the hard work and the good evenings and the child in her arms and the man who made coffee without being asked, and the daughter who was growing into something extraordinary, and the mockingbird who sang every other bird's song and somehow made it his own. She put her hands back in the dirt and kept working. In 1886, when Maybelle was 11 and James Roy was 2, and the farm was producing enough that Lenora had paid off the last of the original equipment debt and purchased a second good horse outright for cash, they found out there would be a second child. This one arrived in the late winter, February of 1887, a girl, and they named her Clara Eleanor, the Eleanor for Timothy's mother, who received the news by letter and wrote back in a hand that seemed to have been affected by the emotion of it. Clara arrived with lungs as formidable as her brother's and dark hair like Lenora's, and over the following weeks showed strong indications of a temperament that was neither her mother's iron nor her father's measured deliberateness, but something that seemed to be distinctly and entirely her own, which was to say loud, curious, and under the impression that everything in her immediate environment existed primarily for her interest. James Roy, by then 2.5, regarded his new sister with the cautious assessment of a person who has been told that a significant change is coming and is now experiencing it. He watched her from a distance for approximately 3 days and then, apparently deciding that she would stay and that a position must be taken, walked up to her blanket on the kitchen floor and offered her his most valued possession, a smooth brown stone that he had found by the creek and carried everywhere, setting it carefully beside her hand. Clara ignored the stone but grabbed his finger, and James Roy looked at the finger and then at his sister, and then at his parents with an expression of something between surprise and satisfaction, and that appeared to settle the matter between them. Maybelle, at 11, had become the kind of girl who had Roy's dark eyes and Lenora's practical intelligence and Timothy's habit of thinking carefully before speaking, and who combined these qualities with a self-possession that occasionally startled adults who were not expecting it from a child. She helped with the younger ones with genuine competence and without excessive complaint, and she had begun, in the evenings, to ask Timothy questions about the cattle business that were more sophisticated than her age might have suggested, which Timothy answered with the full seriousness she expected, because he had learned early that Maybelle's questions were always better than they sounded at first. The drought of 1887 was difficult in the territory, as droughts were always difficult, and Lenora and Timothy worked through it with the same straightforward determination they brought to everything, cutting the herd marginally at Chester's suggestion to reduce grazing pressure, adjusting the crop plan toward the more drought-tolerant varieties, being careful with the well and the creek and the shallow water reserves in the stone catchment that Roy had originally built, and that Hector had repaired and extended during that first remarkable April. The drought lasted through the summer and broke in September with a rain that was a regular rain, moderate and welcome, without any of the violence of the flood spring, and the recovery was measurable by October and good by November. Chester Keel got married himself in the fall of 1887 to a woman named Harriet who had come up from Texas with her brother's family, and who thought Chester was the most straightforward man she had ever met, which she said was a quality she had not previously found in sufficient abundance. Timothy stood up with Chester at the wedding in Colton's Crossing, and Lenora sat in the front pew with James Roy on her lap, and Clara beside her and Maybelle on Clara's other side, and she watched Timothy stand up for his foreman and friend with that easy, uncomplicated loyalty that was so specifically him, and she felt the same warmth she always felt when she watched him be himself. The territory moved toward Oklahoma statehood through the late 1880s with the governmental complexity of a place that was simultaneously frontier and civilization, where the formal land run of 1889 brought more settlers in a single day than the territory had ever seen. and where the question of what was to become of the peoples who had been living on these lands long before any of the homesteaders arrived was handled with the systematic injustice that had been applied throughout the expansion west. The displacement of indigenous people from their allotted lands through legal and extra-legal pressure. The diminishment of sovereign territories through treaty revisions that served the interests of the United States government rather than the people whose land it was. Timothy and Lenora were not unaware of this. They were people of their time in many ways, but they were also people of the specific kind of conscience that manifested in how one treated the actual human beings in one's immediate path, and they treated people decently across the lines that their era often did not expect them to cross. The years accumulated on the farm the way good years did, with the texture of work and weather, and the specific sounds of a household that was alive. James Roy grew into a solid, quiet boy who had his father's thoughtful eyes and his mother's directness, and a particular affinity for animals that expressed itself in his relationship with every creature on the farm, from the horses to the barn cats, to the 2 spotted dogs that had arrived from somewhere over the years in the way that dogs arrived on farms. Clara grew into exactly what her first weeks had promised, loud and curious, and entirely in charge of any situation she found herself in, and everyone around her found this more charming than they might have expected. Maybelle, in the spring of 1890, turned 15, and was the kind of 15 that made Lenora look at her sometimes and feel the specific, bittersweet pride of watching a child become a person that you would genuinely choose on merit as a friend. She had Roy's eyes and Lenora's iron, and something all her own that was bright and clear and entirely intentional. And she had begun, quietly, to talk about wanting more formal schooling than Colton's Crossing's small school could provide, which was a conversation Lenora and Timothy had privately, and to which they had come to the same conclusion independently, which was that they would find a way. One evening in the spring of 1890, late May, warm in the way of that particular season, Lenora and Timothy sat on the porch they had sat on together for 7 years, and the farm was everything around them. The good solid barn that had been built with love and lumber and 4 good men's labor. The fences that had been built and needed rebuilding now in places and would be rebuilt again. The fields that were in their spring green beginning. The cottonwood by the smokehouse with the mockingbird in it. Always the mockingbird, the evening dark coming in from the east over the ridge. "Do you remember what Hector said when he finished the barn?" Lenora asked. "He said it was sound," Timothy said. "Which I believe was the highest possible praise." "It is," she said. "I have used that standard for many things since then." He looked at her sideways, and, "Sound," she said. "All of it sound." He reached over and tucked a piece of her hair back which had come loose from its pin, a thing he did sometimes because he could, the easy intimacy of 8 years. His hand rested against her cheek for a moment and then came back to the arm of his chair. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I have thought about saying for a while." "Say it," she said in the old way. "That April," he said, "when I came here. Chester told me later that he thought I was going off to rebuild a widow's farm out of sentiment for a man I barely knew, and that he thought I was perhaps not being entirely realistic about my motivation." "And was he wrong?" she said. "About the sentiment, no," he said. "I did feel something about Roy Pritchard and what he had built here, but Chester thought sentiment was the whole of it, and it wasn't." He paused. "I rode down here because something in me knew I should. I couldn't have explained it to Chester or to anyone. But when I came through that gate and saw you in the yard with your blue dress and your work gloves and what was left of your farm, something in me said, this is where you are supposed to be. I didn't know what it meant yet. I knew it was true." Lenora looked at him. The evening was very still and the light was almost gone. "I felt something too," she said. "That first morning I thought it was gratitude." "Was it?" he said. "Not entirely," she said. "No, not even mostly." She smiled. "I think it was something more like recognition." "That's the word," he said. "Yes, that's the right word." They sat together in the last of the evening. This woman and this man, on the porch of the farm that had been broken and rebuilt, that had survived a flood and a drought, and the ordinary extraordinary difficulty of life in the Oklahoma Territory in the latter part of the 19th century, on the porch of a house that was full of children and horses and dogs and books, and the smell of good food, and the sound of a mockingbird that would not stop singing someone else's songs, and somehow made them more itself. Lenora reached over and put her hand over Timothy's, where it rested on the chair arm. He turned his hand over and held hers, as he had held it the first time in a different May evening, with the same care and the same certainty. The mockingbird sang. The cottonwood moved. The barn stood solid and right against the last of the sky, exactly as Hector Ruiz had built it in the spring of 1882, sound in the highest sense of the word in every way that mattered. And the farm breathed around them, living and whole, the way good things did when they were properly tended and properly loved. And the evening came in from the east and settled over all of it, quiet and complete, and nothing was unfinished, and nothing was owed, and they were exactly, entirely home.